The board of Elstree Film Studios as an independent non-executive director, where he leads on sustainability. As I said before, Steve, it's a pleasure to have you here and open this cycle of conferences that we actually expect leads us to a major project, a bigger project on TV and audiovisual sustainability. As we said before, if you can turn on your cameras, it would be great because Steve is going to do a presentation asking your participation, just showing your thumbs up or down. So it will be great and more friendly for the presentation. Steve, thank you very much. As I said before, it's a pleasure. It's an honor to have you here. So thank you very much. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Manuel and Marta. Thank you so much for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. And so what I'm going to do is give a bit of a presentation for about 45 minutes. And then after that, there'll be an opportunity, I think, for us to have a conversation and for you to ask questions. I've had a really good introduction, so I'm going to skip through these first few pages, but just to say that my background is as a multi-camera director. So I've worked on a whole range of different types of programs. So this is a screenshot from my website. And the Graham Norton Show is a project I've worked on for the last 20 years. So that's something that I know is seen internationally around the world. On top of that, I'm also the current chair of Directors UK. So Directors UK is a trade organisation that represents the interests of feature film and TV directors in the UK. We're a rights collecting agency, so we collect the royalties that directors get paid for secondary use of their work. But what it's been really useful for me to do is to be able to try and engage the directing community around sustainable conversations as well. So to try and get sort of directors as storytellers to take a bit more notice of the need for us to tell better stories about sustainability and climate solutions. The other thing is that I'm also an Albert ambassador and a trainer. So Albert is the home of sustainability in the UK. And I think this might be quite unique. I'm not sure whether other countries around Europe have similar organizations, but Albert is housed by BAFTA, so the people that do the awards, but it's not run by BAFTA. And actually what Albert does is it brings the industry together to help train the industry in sustainable production techniques, and also to try and get the industry to understand a little bit more about best practice when it comes to telling stories as well about sustainability on screen. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. As you can see here, there are sort of two clear sides of what we do. So the editorial side, which is called Planet Placement. So that's all about how to tell stories about climate solutions and about the kind of behavior changes that we're all going to have to make to tackle climate change. And then the production side of what we do is teaching people how to make their programs more sustainably, so how to reduce their carbon footprints in production. I'll take you through some of the details of what we do in a little bit. The other thing, as was said, is I'm also on the board of Elstree Film Studios. So Elstree Film Studios is one of our oldest film studios in the UK. It's where The Crown is made. It's where Strictly Come Dancing is also made. And it's a very old studio. It's about 90 years old. And so what I'm trying to do with my role on the board is also think about how we need to change the infrastructure of our studios to become more sustainable as well. So that's something that we try to do. And then most recently, I'm trying to phase out some of the directing work I do. And I recently launched a production company called Picture Zero. So that was last year. And the idea is to try and use Picture Zero to tell some of these stories to audiences. So as we say on our websites, that the pictures on our screen shape the way we see the world. And, you know, we want to be able to sort of paint a picture of what sort of zero carbon looks like in the kind of programs we make. And this is an example of some of the content we've been making. So we've recently been doing a series for Water Bear. I don't know whether you get Water Bear in Spain. It's an international SVOD platform. It's kind of described as being Netflix for the natural world. It's free to subscribe to, so if you can get it, it's worth looking at it. So it's called Water Bear, and you can subscribe to that, and they've got a whole range of content there about the natural world and about sort of climate solutions. And what's good about Water Bear is that at the end of the programs, they give audiences an opportunity to sort of engage. They have a kind of call to action where people, when they watch something that they relate to, can then kind of join in and sort of relate to as well. And then last week we released, Picture Zero has made a film called The People versus Climate Change. So the UK had a citizens' assembly on climate change, which the UK Parliament commissioned in 2020. And that was where we got 100 normal citizens to come together and try and learn about the subject of climate change and come up with some of the solutions. And it was an incredible process watching the people go on that journey. And we had exclusive access to that, and we filmed a documentary about that journey. And what I'm going to do is just give you a quick short trailer from that, because again, I think it's useful in showing you how we can change the conversations around climate change to look more at solutions. So here is a quick trailer from the film. Can you hear it? No, whoops. I don't know what I need to do to make that.
Can you try again? No, we can't hear.
I think it might be, I think I might need to, just let me see if I can just change my audio. Okay. If I use the...
Is that working?
No, I'm sorry about that.
No. Oh dear, that's I'm sorry about that. I'm just quickly going to go to audio settings.
Don't worry, it happens.
To see.
Maybe if you use the speakers of the computer might work.
Yeah, let me try that. Hold on. Right.
Marta, perdoneu, teniu un telèfon si necessiteu trucar a informàtica perquè us donin suport?
Let's see if this works.
No, it doesn't work. Is there any option to share audio?
It's not.
You're muted.
Do you think there is an option to share the sound apart from screening?
It doesn't seem to be giving me one. I tell you what, it's a very short trailer, and you know what I can do is I can give you a link to that in the chat, and then you can, if people want to watch it, you could sort of you could do that as well. So if I just see if I can get that, so I'll give everyone a link to it. So
it's a good idea, yeah.
So that's the link to the website where you'll be able to see the trailer on it.
Thank you.
So basically, the trailer is it's basically a film where we've had real people going on this journey. So ordinary people that didn't know anything about climate change before, they learned about climate change, and then they engaged in the solutions. And then what's amazing is that they all fundamentally changed their life really as a result. The people that have been on this experience have fundamentally gone on a journey where they've embraced climate solutions, which I think is really important. Anyway, so back to the presentation, and I just want to take you through some of what we do with Albert and how we do it to embrace sustainability with our industry. So it says here on screen, imagine an optimistic, transformative TV industry at the time of a climate and environmental crisis. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to engage our industry to think about how they can play a role in tackling climate change. And this is our sort of mission statement, that we believe the creative industries offer the greatest opportunity to mobilize positive action for the planet. And we're leading a charge against climate change, bringing the screen industries together to tackle our environmental impact and inspiring audiences to act for a sustainable future. So that's what we want people to do. We believe that storytelling has a real power to sort of paint positive pictures of what a different future could be. And that's what we're trying to encourage people to do. And as I said, I think Albert is quite unique in that we have this thing called the Broadcast Directorate, which are responsible for running Albert. So that is all the public service broadcasters in the UK. So BBC, ITV, Channel 4, all the public service broadcasters, plus the big production companies. And we've also recently had Netflix, YouTube also join this as well. And they help fund the work that Albert does. And then under that Broadcast Directorate, we have 5 different divisions of Albert. So we've got the Education Consortium. So we work very closely with film students, film schools and colleges and universities, helping teach the next generation of filmmakers about this. On the other end, we've got an international consortium. So we also work with partners around the world, trying to help these tools be rolled out to other parts of the world. And then we've also got the news, the TV and the sports consortium that all focus on those different areas of production. And what's great about it in the UK is that all the tools that we have with Albert are free for productions to use. So it's paid for, but when you come as a program maker to need to use the tools, they're free for you to use. So the training courses that we do online are also free for people in our industry to sign up to. So we've actually trained, just in the last year during lockdown, we've trained over 3,000 people. But we've been training people. I've been doing this now for over 6 years. So we're really beginning to get an industry of trained people that understand about climate change and understand about sustainable production, which I think is really fascinating. The other thing to just point out is that in the UK, it's now mandatory for any program maker that's commissioned by one of the public service broadcasters to do a carbon footprint. So you now have to, when you make your program, you have to record a carbon footprint for your production if it's broadcast on TV in the UK. And if you don't do that, it's quite likely that you won't be paid by the production company at the end of the production period when you deliver your program. So you have to now do that, which I think is a really significant thing. It's not quite the same for the film industry because the film industry has a different finance model, but increasingly we're encouraging the film industry to also do similar things. And then, as I said earlier, there are 2 clear divisions to what we do with Albert. So one of them is how we can inspire through content, how we can create content that tries to encourage audiences to think about sustainability differently. And then the other side is how we make our programs more sustainably. So that has things like the carbon calculator that we use, and we encourage people to use these new greener production techniques as well. So what I want to do is just give you a kind of whistle-stop tour of the kind of things we talk to people about when we train them. So the first thing we think is really important for anyone that comes on our training course is to understand about the science and what we call climate context. So understanding about the policy framework that goes around with climate change as well. So we explain a bit about the history of climate change. We talk about the fact that we've known about climate change since about 1912, if not earlier. So despite the fact that we've known about this subject for a very long time, this has tended to be the response that people have had, certainly, in the last 30 years, where we've just buried our head in the sands. And we try to sort of understand why that's been like that, that how complex climate change is as a subject to communicate to people. The fact that it really kind of is very complicated and makes people feel too small. The fact sometimes that people take comfort from the fact that other environmental concerns have been solved. If you think about how the world came together to tackle the ozone hole, we've been quite effective at that. We also talk about the challenges with election cycles, the fact that in the West particularly, we have governments that are re-elected every 4 or 5 years, and that has tended to focus governments on short-term opportunities that allow them to be popular with voters and get re-elected, rather than dealing with something that in the past was considered to be a long-term issue. The fact that we've ignored climate change, of course, means that climate change now is also a short-term crisis as well. We talk about the challenge that we can sometimes think that climate change is somebody else's problem. You know, we all work hard in the media, we've got very busy lives, and sometimes thinking about taking on another subject is really difficult. But I always remember a story that somebody told me when they went filming at the Arctic with climate scientists, and they sort of turned to the climate scientists in a panic and said, "This is so serious, you need to tell more people about this." And of course, the climate scientists just turned around and said, "Well, that's not my job, is it? I'm a scientist, I do science." You know, it's the role of the media to inform people about things as well. So again, you know, we think about how with climate change, there's often an emotional connection to it, isn't it? Sometimes we don't always follow the facts. It's a bit like the Brexit sort of arguments that we had in the UK, isn't it? That, you know, your heart sometimes leads you emotionally rather than kind of always following the scientific facts about something. So that's a big challenge. And of course, it's really complex. So, you know, we know that with climate change, it's a problem which challenges our psychology and our society. So as a result of that, we've created this course, and this is a snapshot of the course that I'm kind of do for you today. And we explain that the slides that we've put together are to allow people in our industry to bring climate into the decisions they make. You know, so thinking about how you can bring climate change into your existing responsibilities as program makers, you know, what kind of decisions you can make differently to sort of take that on board. We explain about the science. We explain that, you know, the world has made an agreement that we want to try and limit global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. You know, that's really important. A lot of people in the UK don't understand that. They don't even understand the basics of the science. We think it's really important to explain that to people. And we also explain how it's sort of not just a science subject, but it's also a human rights issue. We talk about the challenges, the fact that the West has built its economy on fossil fuels over the last 300 or so years. And of course, how in the global South, you know, a lot of countries, you know, have not kind of built their economies like that, but are already suffering the consequences of climate change. So we try to encourage people to think about the climate justice aspects of climate change, which I think is so important for us to understand. We talk about the challenges as well, the fact that, you know, in 2018, the IPCC, the UN body that deals with the science of climate change, have said that we need to make unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So there's a real urgency to do this. And of course, it's quite handy now to think of the parallels with COVID, because arguably we've made unprecedented changes to society over COVID. But I don't think I've ever seen that in relation to climate change yet. And I think it's also important to point out, though, that climate scientists don't agree the solution to climate change is locking people away like we did for COVID. You know, that's not the solution, but we do need to change our structures and systems to sort of have a different way of allowing people to kind of work in a carbon friendly way. We talk about the fact that, you know, CO2 is abundant on the Earth, and that actually it's part of a natural carbon cycle, and getting to understand that, you know, part of the problem is the fact that the fossil fuels that we've been mining and extracting to build our economy are the product of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years of the Earth, and the fact that we've kind of been extracting them and burning them at a very fast rate over the last 300 years has been the problem. That we've changed the balance of the planet by kind of pumping all this CO2 back into the atmosphere at a very, very quick rate. We also try to get people to understand how we know about this, how we can measure CO2. So the fact that we've been measuring CO2, atmospheric CO2, since the early 1950s at the Mauna Loa Observatory, and how you can sort of see the alarming rate at which the CO2 has been increasing. So I think it's really important to get people to understand that, and to understand that we can also go back much further in time. So this particular graph shows what temperature and CO2 have done over the last 500,000 years. And of course, scientists are able to do this by analyzing ice cores, by drilling down at the Arctic and taking these big long cores of ice out, and by shaving through the ice and analyzing the frozen gases at different depths. They know what's been happening in the past. And again, making it very clear that the Earth has had a natural cycle. We can see, can't we, that we've had periods of global heating and global cooling, and that these cycles occur at a sort of a kind of regular interval. But of course, what we can also clearly identify is that CO2 has never gone over 300 parts per million over the sort of last 500,000 years. And of course, when we look at what's happening in modern times now, we can see that it's alarmingly shot up. It's crossed the 400 parts per million threshold a few years ago. It's now standing at about 418 parts per million. So again, that's really serious. And we know that as a result of that, there's an inbuilt temperature rise to still play out. So that's quite alarming. This is another interesting way of looking at this. I don't know whether any of you have seen this before, but this is from a website called showyourstripes.info. And each of these stripes represents the average temperature of the last 150 years. And again, you can clearly see when it's presented in this graphic form, how we had in the past this cooler period, but now we are heating up, and we now, this is what our temperatures look like now. And if you're interested, by the way, you can go to that website and you can type in where you live, and it will download a personalized stripe for what part of the world you live in. So it's called showyourstripes.info. And again, because we know different parts of the world are warming at different rates, the pattern is slightly different depending on whether you're in Europe or Africa or America, but it's still largely the same kind of blue to red pattern that we're seeing. We talk about the challenges of kind of where we export and import some of the products that we have, particularly in the UK. We've closed down a lot of our manufacturing capacity, and we import a lot of our products from places like China. So of course, that's a big challenge, understanding when we criticize China, the fact that we have effectively exported some of our CO2 emissions to that country when they manufacture the consumer goods that we buy. So we talk about that, which I think is a big challenge for us. And then we also have a snapshot of how this is impacting the world, how we are disrupting our weather systems. So this map here shows the temperature on a particular day in February 2018. And again, alarmingly, you can see how Northern Europe is colder than the Arctic Circle. And we're seeing this disruption to our weather systems happening more frequently. You may well have seen in the news at the beginning of the year how Texas was kind of covered in snow and ice. And again, that was, that was very unprecedented. We can see how we're increasing the number of bushfires and forest fires around the world. And obviously that alarming image from Australia at the beginning of 2020, and how at an increasingly warmer world, we're seeing more extreme fires. And this is what we get with temperatures having increased to an average of 1.2 degrees. So we're quite a long way on that 1.5 degree trajectory. And then of course, we talk about the problems of things like food shortages as well. So this is an image from a Russian grain store. And Russia is traditionally an exporter of grain, particularly to places like the Middle East. And in 2010, for example, there was a drought, and it meant that Russia had an export embargo. So as a result of that, it helped create food shortages in parts of Africa and the Middle East, which of course creates tensions in the world as well. And so we ask a question of whether we're close to a tipping point where we end up with runaway climate change. So we ask the people in our industry to sort of think about the consequences of that and what that might mean for us. And then, as I say, we talk a bit about social justice issues as well. So the fact that we know, experts believe that by 2050, we could be seeing 200 million people being displaced by climate change factors. The effects it's already having on vulnerable communities in the global south. So this is an image from the Pacific island of Kiribati, who are already facing rising sea levels, and that's hugely impacting their way of life. But it's not just in the global south as well. This is an image from Alaska from a community called Newtok, and they've had to relocate their towns and villages away from the coast because of rising sea levels, but also subsidence caused by the melting of the permafrost, which is causing their buildings to collapse. And of course, this is a very poor community, and they've had to spend millions of pounds relocating their homes. We talk about climate justice and racial injustice. You know, we make the points that, you know, for example, in America, Black Americans are exposed to 56% more pollution than they cause, and white Americans breathe 17% less pollution than they produce. You know, so how that impacts on a racial injustice aspect. And of course, thinking about intergenerational injustice as well, you know, how young people are going to be impacted by climate change, but also young people are beginning to be much more conscious, particularly of things like sustainable fashion. You know, young people are trying to make the right decisions about how they consume things. We also talk about the gender gap that we see with climate change. So in the UK particularly, there's a gender gap. 71% of women try to be more ethically in the way they live, compared to only 59% of men. And we talk about all the impacts that climate change will have for the UK. You know, all these things that we are in a wealthy country in the Northern Hemisphere are going to have to prepare ourselves for as well in the coming years. So one of the areas we speak about particularly is flooding. So I'm not sure what it's been like in Spain over the recent years, but in the UK particularly, we've had a lot more flooding. Our extreme weather is impacting the country quite a lot now. And of course, we get these famous storms that get named. So last year we had Storm Kira, Storm Dennis, and Storm Ellen, and they brought huge deluges of rain to the UK, which created lots of flooding. And at the beginning of this year, we also had Storm Christoph, which flooded the UK. And in parts of the UK now, people have been flooded not just once, but 2 or 3 times. And imagine the emotional stress of being flooded out of your home several times. We talk about the economic side of climate change. We talk about the fact that preparedness for a changing climate is going to be the dominant factor in the long-term economic viability of any industry, and how it's important that industries understand that. And we also talk about the need to support ethical investments and to kind of move and divest money away from old fossil fuel investments, and how there's a real sensible reason to do that, because of course ethical investments are now starting to outperform the old fossil fuel ones by quite a long way. And then we also talk about trying to understand carbon footprints as well. But there's a particular thing which I think is important for our industry. And you know, we say that a carbon footprint is the best estimate that we can get of the full climate change impact of something. But we say it's really important in film and TV production, if you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint, to understand the difference between a toe print and a footprint. So toe prints are things like water bottles and paper reuse and recycling. These are things that we should be doing, but we mustn't fool ourselves and get obsessed by them, because those are quite small things in the scheme of things. If we want to be strategic about reducing the impact of a production, we have to focus on the big things like energy, travel, diet, and shopping, because those are always the ways that we're going to have a bigger reduction in our footprints if we can deal with those things. And we talk about personal carbon footprints as well. So this is a list of things that in the UK equates to a footprint of around 13 tons of carbon per year for an individual. And that's sort of the average carbon footprint in the UK now. It's between about 13 and 15 tons of carbon. And how we need to get that down, you know, if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. But of course, carbon footprints are difficult, aren't they? There's a controversy around them that actually some people acknowledge that they were introduced by the fossil fuel industry as a way of reflecting kind of the focus on individual behavior rather than on the fossil fuel industry. And of course, you know, carbon footprints are important, but what's more important is to make sure that we have a society that gives us the opportunity to make better choices about how we do things so that we can reduce our footprints. For a lot of people in the UK, they don't have a choice, you know, as to how they travel or kind of how they heat their homes. You know, it's quite difficult at the moment, and so that has to be thought about. So what I'm also going to do now is I'm going to play a quick game with you that we do to try and get people to think about the carbon impacts of everyday activities. So what I'm going to do is ask you to say higher or lower. I'm going to show you a series of activities, and I want you to tell me whether the next activity is higher or lower in the amount of carbon it uses. So for higher, you could just do your thumbs up. For lower, you could do your thumbs down, or you might be able to use, there might be a thumbs up button that you can use as well if you've got your cameras off. And for this game, I'm going to get you to imagine that one of these balloons has about 17 grams of carbon. So what I want to do is say 150 gram punnets of locally grown and in-season strawberries in the UK would have a carbon footprint of around 8.5 of those balloons. But of course, if you fly strawberries in from abroad out of season, what does that do to the carbon footprint? Is it higher or lower? What would you say? Yeah, it's obvious, isn't it? It's got to be higher because you're bringing them in from abroad, but it's 99 of those balloons. It's a significant increase, you know, so understanding that's important. Drinking a latte made with cow's milk, you know, we know dairy is high carbon food. Is that higher or lower than the strawberries, would you say? Okay, it's actually slightly lower, but it's still quite a lot, isn't it? Because we know dairy is a high carbon food. But if we swap it out for oat milk, again, we can sort of see the impact, which of course is lower. So we have a lower carbon footprint for that. So again, understanding the choices we make over foods. Watching a two hours of a football match on a plasma TV, is that higher or lower than the oat milk latte? Well, it's using electricity and power. It's actually higher. If we were to watch the same football match on a tablet on 4G, this is a trick question that obviously sometimes catches people out. It's actually higher. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that 4G is quite energy intensive. So again, a huge challenge for our industry as we have more streaming services and cloud-based systems. You know, these things are quite energy intensive for our industry. We also talk about, you know, LED lighting. So leaving an LED light bulb on for a year is a lot lower. It's a very low footprint because LED lighting is so efficient. So again, understanding the need to use LED lighting in our industry rather than old tungsten lighting. Thinking about a cotton t-shirt, we know that fast fashion has a high carbon footprint. And again, you can see how that impacts. Thinking about eating meat, and again, we know that red meat has a significant carbon footprint. So, you know, huge amount of those balloons there for a steak. Thinking about printing, you know, and again, I think that's still quite a high footprint for printing something. And of course, you know, how we can use emails and digital systems now instead of printing things, which has a much lower footprint. And thinking about travel, our industry does a lot of travel. Traveling by train is one of the most eco-friendly ways that you can travel, but it still has a large footprint. But of course, then understanding if you do the same distance by plane, how much worse that is, you know, a whopping 5,000 and 355 of those balloons. And again, how we've learned to work differently through COVID by meeting like we are tonight on Zoom, and how significantly reduced that footprint is as well. So for us, these are some ways of getting people to think about the different day-to-day activities that they have and the carbon impact. So we can try and get people to understand that and think about that. We also talk about the challenge ahead, how from the Paris Climate Agreement, we made this commitment to hold temperatures to between 1.5 and 2 degrees, but how we're going on this trajectory for kind of 3 or 4 degrees, and how we need to bridge that gap, which is going to happen at COP26 in Glasgow, how we need to get the world to come together to have new policies that will reduce our emissions. And if we don't, the urgency, because this is what a 4-degree warmer world looks like by the end of the century. And I've got bad news for you in Spain. You know, all these areas that are yellow and brown are places that could be uninhabitable if we hit 4 degrees of warming. You know, effectively, according to this map, Spain becomes a great big solar park with a lot of desert. You know, it's so serious that we have to kind of get on top of this. And also understanding the consequences of all these people in the global south that are going to have to kind of migrate further north. Because of their areas being uninhabitable. So that's why it's so important for our industry to do this. And how, in order to do this, we have to halve emissions every decade for the next 3 decades until we get to net zero by 2050. And how the broadcast industry is not exempt from this, how we need to do all these things. So that's explaining the context of everything. I think this is a really interesting kind of quote here. We often hear people in the West sort of say, why should we do this if China doesn't do it? And Mary Hegler says that blaming majority non-white nations such as India and China for risking a climate catastrophe by not taking appropriate transitional measures is the biggest gaslight in history. You know, it's understanding that we have benefited with our economies over the last 300 years. And so we have a leadership role that we have to take in this as well. And of course, it's not fair to say China's not doing anything, because China does a lot of things. Okay, it still uses a lot of coal, which needs to sort of stop. But China's manufacturing capacity has helped reduce the cost of renewable technologies like solar and wind. And of course, China have made their own net zero commitments by 2060. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of pressure put on China to bring that forward at COP26. And again, understanding what Christiana Figueres says. So Christiana was the woman who negotiated the Paris Climate Agreement. And she says we must drag the future into the present. And what we interpret that as meaning is really understanding the future implications of our actions and including them in our decision-making process. So when we make a TV film or a program, you know, understanding that everything we do has a carbon impact that will impact the future. And if we can think about that, we can change it and do something differently. We encourage people to take some of these steps to reduce their carbon footprints themselves. So sign up to some of these pledges and promises, which I think is quite useful. And then we also talk about what we can do in sustainable production as well. So how we can reduce the environmental impacts of productions and how we use our tools at Albert to do that. So as I was saying earlier, we have to understand the difference between carbon toe prints and footprints. So our advice to everybody when you start a production is, if you want to think of ways of reducing its footprint, always think of these three areas like energy, travel, and materials, because if you can find ways of decarbonizing those, then you're on a good journey to kind of reduce the footprint of your program. So for example, if you're going to be a location-based documentary, travel is always probably going to be your biggest impact. So finding a way to decarbonize your travel is really good. You know, if you're going to be in an electronic TV studio doing a kind of game show or an entertainment program, the chances are it's going to be energy, because you use lots of electricity with all the power and the lighting and the cameras, and also materials with your sets and costumes. So again, thinking about how you can reduce that. And likewise, you know, if you're a big high-end drama or a kind of costume drama or a feature film, it's going to be all three of these things that are going to make a big impact. So again, just think of these things individually and how you can reduce those. And as a result of the fact that we have this carbon calculator, all the data that we record from all these productions is stored on the calculator. And so it gives us the ability to see how our industry is doing over a period of time. So we can see the different genres here and how drama accounts for nearly 40 tons of carbon per hour of drama, and how, you know, international factual, you know, those kind of nature programs that we see, you know, that's just under 30 tons of carbon. And of course, remembering that the average carbon footprint for an individual is about 12 tons. So our industry is significant. And again, because it's color coded, we can see all the different areas that contribute to the production's footprint. And again, because we've been measuring that over a period, over 10 years, we can see how our footprint is now finally starting to fall as a result of some of these measures being in place. So in the early days, it appeared that our footprint was increasing. We don't think that was happening. What it was as more productions engaged in carbon calculations, we got a clearer idea of how we were working. And so we think that the average carbon footprint of around 12 tons for an average program was about right. And of course, what we've seen in recent years is that because people are now starting to work more sustainably, we're seeing this footprint slowly come down. And I know that through COVID, because some of the measures we took, it continued to come down in 2020. So that's some positive news for our industry. And I think it's really good to be able to have the tools to be able to measure something and see how it's working over a period of time. And then We also have lots of case studies. So on the website for Albert, we encourage productions to share their best practice. So these are 4 examples of programs. So the feature film 1917 was the first feature film in the UK that got Albert certification to show that it had taken action to reduce its carbon footprint. And they did lots of great things, you know, from using waste vegetable oil to run some of their generators, through to choosing to film everything in the UK so they didn't have to travel to France. Lots of things that they did. Patagonia, this was a documentary about Patagonia. And again, that was another fascinating project where instead of flying a film crew from the UK to Patagonia, they chose to use local crews, and they saved a huge amount of money for not traveling by plane, but also they saved a lot of money on excess, excess baggage for all the equipment. And as a result, they saved not just carbon, but they saved money that they could reinvest in different ways on the production. So lots of great things that can be done. And again, on our website, we have guides of the things that you can do in your different job roles. So, you know, if you're a costume designer, what kind of things can you do? This was a case study from a drama that was shot in France. And again, by using local crews in France rather than taking people from the UK, they were able to save £100,000 in transport and accommodation costs and a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to the first series that they did. Again, it's a huge saving that we can invest elsewhere on screen. You know, how during COVID, we've learned new skills. We do more remote filming, using local talent and going paperless, using digital solutions. And again, a lot of people kind of talk about the problem with single-use plastics and PPE for COVID. And it's not ideal, it's a problem. But again, understanding that in the scheme of things, that's a carbon toe print. It's not that important in your footprint. It would be better that we didn't have it. But actually, the most important thing about single-use plastic is making sure it's disposed of correctly. You know, that's the thing, so it doesn't get into our water systems. So again, we've done more case studies out of COVID. And as I said earlier, we use a carbon calculator. It's an online tool that we use, which is really simple for productions to use. And basically, there's a series of tabs where productions have to answer questions of the sort of way that they make their programs. So whether they're in a studio, whether they're on location, what kind of transport they use, how many people work on the program, whether they travel by private car or plane or train, whether they spend time in hotels. So all this information is very simple to get together online. And what we do is we ask productions to do a predicted footprint at the beginning of the production and a final footprint at the end of the production. And the reason for that is hopefully when you've done your predicted footprint, when you've worked out your budget and you know what you're going to do, you can then think of ways to reduce that footprint by working strategically. And then hopefully your final carbon footprint should be less. And we've also got a system of certification in the UK as well. So on top of just recording your footprint, we have this system where we can certify productions that go a step further. So if a production wants to demonstrate that they have made an effort to reduce their footprint, they have to kind of show us the evidence that they've done that. And when we see that evidence and audit it, if we're happy with it, we allow them to use this logo at the end of their production. So this says that they are a carbon neutral, sustainable production. And carbon neutrality is something new that was introduced at the beginning of 2021. And what this means is that if a production can't eliminate its footprint to zero completely, what they have to do now is they have to pay to offset it. And they have to obviously factor that into their budget. And again, we found that the sort of typical cost of offsetting a production is just 0.1% of the production budget. So it's kind of affordable. I offset something recently. We used just under a ton of carbon, which is a low amount of carbon for a production anyway, but it cost us just over 65 UK pounds to offset that. So again, you know, offsetting isn't ideal. It's better that we don't emit the carbon in the first place. But if there's no choice, actually making people pay to offset it, I think starts to get people to think about the financial cost of carbon and hopefully it gets productions to start thinking to save money, they need to try and reduce their carbon further so they don't have to pay for offsetting. So this is what we call the route map to offsetting. You do your predicted carbon footprint, you have a carbon action plan to work out how you're going to reduce it, you reduce your emissions, you do a final carbon footprint, you offset it, and then you get certified and you can use the logo on screen. So that's about how we make our programs more sustainably. But finally, I just want to end up talking about this thing that we call planet placement, which is how we can inspire people through the storytelling. And we talk about carbon brain prints a lot. We talk about the positive impact our brain print can have on other people's footprints. So for example, this documentary called The End of the Line, The World Without Fish, is attributed for getting two big companies in the UK, Whiskas, a pet food company, and Pret a Manger, the cafe. As a result of watching this film, they both made a policy change to use sustainable sourced fish. So again, it shows, doesn't it, the impact we as program makers can have on inspiring other people to change. And what we wanted to do is find out what kind of conversation we were having about climate change in the UK. And Albert came up with this genius way of measuring it. We decided to analyze the subtitles of a whole year's worth of TV content in the UK from all of our public service broadcasters. And by analyzing those subtitles, we could look for different environmental themes and words. So by looking for those words, we could find out what we were talking about on TV. And what we clearly found out is that the last time we did this, we were talking about climate change just around 13,000 times. And yet compared to all these other subjects that we were talking about, you know, dogs, war, Brexit, you can see how little we were talking about climate change in the UK. So this is a really helpful evidence-based tool that allows us to shift the conversation, and it allows us to go back to broadcasters and say how urgent it is that we change that conversation on screen. And again, we've done this in 2018, 2019, and we're doing the whole thing again in 2020. So again, it's collecting the evidence to show the progress that our industry is making, which I think is really helpful. So it's all evidence-based. And why is this important? Well, it's important because all of these factors that you can see on screen are things that we're going to have to address and have behavior change in order to get to net zero. You know, we've been effective in the UK by decarbonising our energy system. But of course, when you decarbonise the energy sector, someone hasn't had to change their lifestyle when they switch on their light. And of course, for the next decade, all the things we're going to have to do will require a degree of behavior change. So what we're saying is, can we imagine making TV shows about all of these subjects? Well, the question is, we already do that. It's just, do we make them in a way that talks about the behavior changes we're going to have to make? Or are we still making programs that celebrate a high carbon lifestyle? And again, these are examples of some programs in the UK that are starting to do things slightly differently. And we talk about the lessons we can learn from other industry issues as well. So for example, how often should we talk about climate change? And what can we learn from swearing and profanity? And what we would say is that in the UK, we don't count racial slurs and reflect them on screen. When it comes to issues like racism, the mirror we hold up to society has rules attached to it. And again, we would say that's the same for climate change. You know, the way we talk about climate change should have some sort of rules associated with it. And again, is talking about climate change enough, or what can we learn from diversity? We know that we don't just want programs about diversity. We need to have diverse programs made by diverse program makers. And likewise, we don't think we just want programs about climate change. We need to reflect climate considerations in contemporary program. And of course, do we have to engage with the science, and what can we learn from younger audiences? Well, we know that younger audiences are deserting our industry. They're watching things on YouTube, they're not watching terrestrial TV. And we would argue that by engaging with the science, which young people understand, we may find programs that we can attract younger viewers to as well. So to just wrap up, I know I've slightly gone over length, to just wrap up, as Kate Blanchett says, there's no greater challenge facing us as a species than climate change, but we human beings are capable of so very much. And of course, there are solutions, they're already out there. We just need to harness them. And of course, these are our audiences too, this generation who are now out on the streets protesting. You know, we have to make sure that we stay relevant to these young people. So we always end when we teach these things by asking the people that have engaged in the course to make 2 personal pledges. So one is how they can lead with a personal action that reduces their carbon footprint, either in the workplace or at home or both. And then we also ask people to think, how can you support planet placement in your work? How can you support storytelling? You know, can you do things like normalize sustainable behavior on screen by the kind of things you show in your programs? Or can you have an opportunity to talk about climate solutions in your content? You know, so we ask people to think about these things and see if they can incorporate them in their workplace. And then we also ask people if they want to, yeah, we do 2 courses. So we do the sustainable production course, and we also do the planet placement course as separate courses. So I've just given you a big kind of overview of everything today. And then we also kind of all the things that we do, we store on the Albert website, and we also run lots of events as well that we encourage people to sign up to and come along to. So recently we held this thing called a Sustainable Soap Summit. So that's where we get all the producers and writers of soap operas in the UK to come together to talk about how we can incorporate some of these issues in the storytelling they do in soap operas. Because of course, those programs are things that have always dealt with big societal issues in the past and can help move audiences and get people to change. And then of course, we're very keen that people follow us on social media as well, so that they can share kind of the best experience with people, so that we can highlight when people do good things and share them with the community that we're building. So that's really the end of my presentation. So I hope it's been interesting. If I stop sharing my screen and then I can sort of see everybody more clearly. And I see that there might be some things in the chat. So if I just look at the chat, if I can find it.
Thank you so much, Steve, for such a great presentation. There's clearly an emergency for the media to reply to the environmental, to climate crisis. And there's clearly also a shift on conceptions between race, gender, and the dichotomy between north.
So how do we want to proceed now? Do you want to ask me some questions?
Yeah, for sure. We would also like to invite people to, you know.
You can still hear me, can you?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly, and we will invite audiences to raise their questions.
I can't hear anybody else.
What?
You can't hear us? See? No. The rest of the people can hear us? Yes, thank you.
So Steve, you cannot hear us?
Oh, can you, so do I need to do something with my sound? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly, yeah.
You can hear me, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
It's strange, I don't know why I can't hear. I can't see. Does somebody want to take back control? I don't know whether I've been made a co-host because of sharing my screen.
Okay, do you want me to? Can you hear us now?
Should I try logging out and logging back in again? Shall I leave and come back to the meeting and see if that works?
Let's go try that. Yeah.
I'm going to leave and come back.
Okay.
Okay, in the meanwhile, we would like to invite you to send your questions to the chat. I don't think you can, maybe they can participate unmuting your microphones, or even sharing your questions and comments through the chat.
Hello,
Okay.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfectly. Can you hear us? No?
I still can't hear you.
Oh. Yeah. Sì, digli che
Does somebody else want to try and unmute and speak to me in case it's a problem with Marta?
We try with some of you. Could you address
Hi,
the
this is
question?
Monserrat.
Hi.
I'm trying to speak. Can
I
you hear me?
I can't hear.
Can you hear me, Steve?
Let me get these.
Can somebody else hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, we can hear
Okay.
you, Montserrat. We are so sorry about that.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. So we were inviting the rest of the audience to participate and send the questions.
Fabulous.
Is there any question or comment for such a terrific presentation? Thank you very much, Steve. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I have to say something. I would like to say that they are very well organized. You are very well organized. Come on, that's not fair.
Can I say that it's been a journey in the UK? So this Albert has been running now for 10 years, and in the last few years there's been a huge progress as more people have become engaged and interested. When we first started, it was very challenging getting the industry to change, and I think what has been particularly helpful in the UK is the way that our public broadcast service is funded. It's meant that broadcasters can kind of make things mandatory, and if you don't engage with it, you don't get commissioned and you don't get paid. So that's been really helpful.
Yeah. From your presentation, that's what I first thought, that this engagement of the public broadcasters is a key thing or whatever to in order to develop all this policy. Of course, I envy you in a good way, but we envy you.
Absolutely, and I have to say that the BBC have played a leading role in this. The thing that I think is challenging, though, is the disconnect between making things sustainably, which I think is really important that we need to do, because we all have to get to net zero. Yeah. And the BBC at a corporate level, and all the broadcasters in the UK at a corporate level have got policies to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2035. Mm-hmm. So that's important. But I think the bigger role that we have to play is the storytelling, because audiences still rely on TV as the main source of information and news. And I think that the bigger challenge for us is how we communicate that to the audiences that we serve. And I don't think we've really started there yet. So I think we're still quite slow at doing that.
So Steve, for instance, you talk about storytellers. I think you're saying in the sense of content. So like talk more about climate change, as we said, as you perfectly said, with the subtitles and stuff. However, do you think there's a need for audiences to also know about sustainable production? So what's going on behind the scenes and how can we communicate that to them?
I think it's less important that audiences know that. I think because we've got this logo that goes on the end of our credits for sustainable productions, hopefully what happens is people will see that and they'll start going, well, what does that mean and what's that about? So hopefully they will understand that. But I think in a way, I still think that's what's more important is educating people. I mean, we have invested a lot of money in the industry educating program makers, because we believe that once you're educated and understand this, you can make a difference. And I think, it's then our role, once we've been educated, I think it's our role to then try and help educate the wider public and the audiences that we serve. And I still think that's the kind of most important thing that we can do, because we need to get wide public engagement to understand the things that need to be done over the next decade.
Thank you. We have a question by Sarah Vignals. She says, "Hi, Steve. Great talk today. One question. What would be your suggestion to keep a positive tone when creating content? Many programs fall into a catastrophic narrative that can scare away an audience." And she apologizes for not having the camera on.
No, that's good. And I think it's a brilliant question. It's very important. And I think that in recent years, there have been quite a few programs that talk about the problem of climate change. We see the sort of apocalyptic kind of disaster type things. Some people call it climate porn. And I think that's had a role in making people aware that there's a big problem. But I think that can be very self-defeating, because I think it terrifies people. It makes people think it's pointless and hopeless to do things. And one of the arguments that we have is I think we need to start moving and having much more positive climate solutions-based content. In the UK last year, a charity did some research about how we can have different approaches in storytelling. And what's very clear is audiences respond much better to positive approaches than negative stuff. And so instead of talking about, nature's disaster, we could talk about nature's great comeback, how nature can revive itself. And that's one of the reasons why the documentary I've made, The Citizens versus Climate Change, is so helpful, because we tell positive stories. We look at the kind of things, and I guess we as storytellers have a duty to kind of show what the future could look like, don't we? We don't want to just show the future as being negative. We also want to show that the future could be positive as well.
So taking this kind of approach, do you think we can, how can we avoid, for instance, narratives that look like or could be criticized as greenwashing, for instance?
Yeah, I think there is a challenge in our consumer-driven society, isn't there? Because we still have that sense of celebrating celebrities, celebrating glamorous, high carbon lifestyles, fast cars, lots of foreign travel, glamorous fashion. There is a danger that I think we kind of still celebrate that. And I think one of the problems that we faced in the UK, and it may be the same for you in Spain, is that we don't have as much investigative journalism anymore. Back in the 1980s, we had some really brilliant investigative journalists, and they could they had the money and the resources to be able to sort of investigate corporations and companies that were kind of doing bad things. I mean, I don't know whether you've seen the news this week. We've in the UK been discovering that we export so much of our waste plastic to Turkey now, and in Turkey it's not being disposed of, it's not being recycled, it's often just being dumped and burned. And again, we need to challenge those companies and corporations that pretend they're recycling their plastic, but actually they're not. They're just shipping it away to another country. And so I do think we need to invest in investigative journalism and current affairs. I think that's got a really important role to play. But I think also the people that commission content need to think about their values as well. In the UK recently, two of our broadcasters commissioned programs about fast fashion. And I think they were thinking that that would appeal to younger audiences that they're trying to appeal to, and that by, you know, experiencing a documentary that talks about social media influencers that kind of go out there and try to sell fashion, that it would be exciting and people would like it. What was really interesting is that those programs didn't get good ratings, so the viewers didn't kind of watch them. And also, I would argue, we've got lots of brilliant sustainable fashion brands. So why don't, if we're going to make a documentary about fashion, why don't we make a documentary celebrating sustainable brands rather than the fast fashion brands that are not good for the planet? And I would say that if we're going to commission these things, what does it say about our values as commissioning editors if we want to celebrate things that are bad for the planet rather than things that are good for it?
5 motivos para vacinar as lactantes.
Sorry, Daniela, you wanted to ask something? No? Okay, then I have a question. It is related to this gap between generations of creators. It seems movements favoring the sustainability in general seem to be carried out by youngsters or young creators, and we can see this this gap between two generations. How do you think we can encourage the older creators or the traditional industry into sustainable forms of production? Thank you.
It is a challenge, and again, I think the courses that we do are helpful, because I think educating people and getting people to understand that there's a problem is really important. But younger people, because they're more aware about climate change, younger people in our industry are embracing these things already, which is really good. It's very difficult sometimes getting people to change their behaviors. I mean, if you're a lighting cameraman and you've always worked in a certain way, then trying to get you to change is quite difficult sometimes. Likewise, you know, there's a lot of resistance from people about wanting to have printed paper scripts for things and not wanting to work in a digital environment because they think it won't be as good. And I think you just have to be very patient. I think you just have to try and encourage people to give it a go, and hope that people then realize it's not as difficult as they thought it was. I mean, you know, I think humans generally are resistant to change, aren't we? We get into sort of habits, we form habits, we kind of like to do the same thing that we've always done. So it is a challenge. I think it's helpful if you can lead by example. I think sometimes lecturing people and finger wagging isn't effective. So I think in a way, what I would encourage people to do, younger people that work in production, is lead by example. If you can set a good example and show people that it can be done, then hopefully other people become less resistant and they sort of follow and fall into place as well.
Thank you, Steve.
I don't know if there's any more questions from the audiences. Maybe you can write them on the chat, or you can put your mic on. So I was wondering, at a time where there's so much visual production, from television to videos on demand, platforms like Netflix and Hulu, but where there's a lot of competition and uncertainty about economic and audience viability, low-cost production has become really widespread. So could this lead to a step back or a relaxation in the requirement of sustainable practices?
I think you're right. I think there's a danger. And of course, there are two issues here as well, aren't there? That it's not just cheaper productions could be less sustainable. It's also that they're less viable for people to work on, aren't they? In the UK and across the world, following things like the Me Too movement, and talking about mental health awareness much more. There's a big pressure, I think, coming to think about how we can make the workplace a better and a fairer place for everyone. And I would argue that perhaps TV has become a little bit too cheap in recent years, and it might be that we need to sort of try and encourage people to make fewer programs, but give them better resources and make them better. But of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that sustainable production techniques are quite often cheaper as well. So if your budget is tighter, if you can work in a more sustainable way, then I think the chances are you can be a cheaper production as well. You know, for example, we've learned how to work remotely through COVID. You know, do we need to have these big expensive production offices where you make everyone commute to them and work in them? You know, is that something that adds to the cost of programs? Is that something we sort of need? We've also learned that we don't have to travel camera crew around the world, that we can get really good crews in different parts of the world to collaborate with and make projects with us, which reduces the cost, and it also reduces the carbon footprint. You know, technology has a role to play as well. You know, LED lighting, which is much more kind of efficient, means that you spend less money on your energy bills for a production as well. So I would argue, if you've got a tight budget, it's more important to embrace these things, because I think it will help you to be more efficient.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Sebastian Mary, where he says, how could be the calculators be shared and make a more global certification? So you talk about the logo at the end. I don't think that's shared everywhere. So yeah, if you could answer that, thanks.
So, sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Just say it again.
So how could the calculators be shared and make a more global certification?
Right. Okay, I understand. Well, that's one of the things that we're doing as part of the international division of Albert. So we are working with other people around the world to do this. So there are, I believe in Holland, I think they're starting to use the tools. I think we might be doing something in Canada. So that is something that we're keen to do. So, you know, if there are people in Spain that are interested in trying to find more about this, I'm sure. In fact, Rosa from Albert, who looks after the international, is Spanish. So she's been working for Albert for the last 10 years, and you know, she looks after the international side of things. So there are opportunities for us to collaborate. It would be brilliant to share these tools. I know that in other countries, America have got slightly different tools that they use. So perhaps there's an argument to try and standardize things, possibly, which would help.
So
there is another question by Sebastian as well. He asked, which institutions should drive it in a country?
I think the success that we've had is because it's been broadcaster driven. I think that in the UK, particularly the BBC, have such a big influence over our industry. And I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with the Spanish broadcasting system to know whether you've got a big institution in Spain like the BBC. But because the BBC commissions so much content, if they make a decision that they want to do this, it forces production companies to have to follow the guidelines and the regulations. We also in the UK have quite effective regulators. We've got a regulator called Ofcom, and again, you know, the regulation does sort of help. So I would say broadcasters wanting this to happen is important, and perhaps a regulatory framework would help. But you know, increasingly, you know, program makers understand the need to do this. So there may well be an opportunity to encourage people to do it because they think it's the right thing to do as well. You know, so that could be quite effective. And don't forget, our industry is becoming much more international as well. I mean, I'm sure that, you know, Netflix, I know, want to go on this journey, and Netflix will be commissioning content in Spain. So there may be opportunities there for these new SVOD players to help drive change as well.
Thank you so much. Remember that as Sebastian is doing, you can send your questions over the chat. I have another question, because you were telling how there's regulation on the TV industry, but not so much in the film industry. So, and relating to this question, how can we seek the complicity of not only the makers, but also the users to contribute to demand sustainable production from larger suppliers?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, the challenge for the film industry is because it's funded very differently from TV. You know, with the TV industry, you've got broadcasters who still contribute the biggest amount of money to a TV production. Even if you're getting co-production money, the broadcasters are still funding it. With the film industry, because the funding model is often very different, you've got several different people funding it. There's not the same incentive for them to try and get sort of a sustainable outcome. What has happened in the UK is that public funding that goes into filmmaking, so the BFI, for example, who are one of the people that fund a lot of our films, the BFI are able to try and sort of encourage sustainable production. So they've had a kind of a plan in recent years that expects people to sort of think about three things: so diversity, and sort of sustainability, and sort of equality issues as well. So it's quite good that they've had a role to play. In terms of audiences driving this, I think it goes back to my other question, which is making sure that audiences understand enough about climate change and sustainability to know that they want to drive this. I think that building that awareness amongst audiences is really important. So audiences want to make more sustainable choices, and therefore that will encourage businesses to do things. We're seeing that start to happen, but I think it's challenging for our industry. And of course, remember, our industry has suffered greatly through COVID. The fact that cinemas have been closed. People have become much more used to watching content at home, which probably is more sustainable. It probably reduces the carbon footprint instead of going to cinemas. But that's not always great for our industry, is it? The shared viewing experience, I think, is so important.
Thank you very much. I was a bit curious about this project related to soap operas. I know that soap opera tradition in the UK is huge, and you have many of them in practically every channel. So I would like to ask you, how do you work with soap opera producers and screenwriters? What is the process, and how do you approach to the issue of sustainability with them?
Sure. Well, you're right that there's a big tradition of soap operas in the UK, and nearly every channel has got a soap opera or more than one soap opera. And again, there's a tradition in the UK that soap operas have dealt with some of the really big societal issues over the years. So things like HIV and AIDS, LGBT issues, mental health issues, all of these things have become really important storylines for soap operas. There's a famous soap opera called Coronation Street that right now has got a storyline about how a young girl who was a goth was beaten up and her boyfriend was killed by people because she was different and she stood out, and they kind of like found that intimidating. So our soaps have a great tradition of doing this. So when it comes to climate change, what we're saying to them is, first of all, we need to educate the producers and the writers. We need to make sure that they understand the scale of the problem and the solutions. And then there are two key things that I think we ask them to try and do. So one is, how can we normalize sustainable behavior on screen? So simple things, if you think about, in the UK, we've had a very effective campaign for making people wear seatbelts. And that's something that was helped by normalizing that behavior on TV programs. The way that we try and responsibly show smoking, again, normalizing that behavior. So what we're saying to people is, can we show things on screen that make sustainable behavior normal? So have solar panels on the roofs of the homes in the soap operas, get people to be seen to be recycling. A lot of soap operas happen in kitchens. So when you're talking and having dialogue in kitchens, can you show people putting food waste in a compost bin rather than throwing it away? Can you go into a cafe with a reusable cup and get it filled up? So these are things that we try and encourage directors to think about. So when you're directing the action, these are just very small things that you can do. And then on top of this, we're also saying, what about the storylines that you can introduce? So young people in soap operas, can you show them involved in climate strikes, like Greta and like all the thousands of young people that go on strike every Friday? Can you show characters that have made choices to become vegetarian or vegan and why they've done that? Can you show people, younger people perhaps, that have chosen to buy sustainable fashion? Could you have in a storyline someone who is setting up an electric vehicle kind of car business, because we've had businesses and soaps. Can we have someone set up a sustainable fashion shop that sells secondhand fashion? And also we like disasters in soap operas as well, don't we? We always have things like plane crashes and coach crashes. Could we consider flooding one of our soaps to show the reality of kind of flooding in the UK? So there are opportunities to do things like that as well. And so what we do is we bring all these producers and writers together in a conference, and then we allow them to sort of discuss these ideas amongst themselves, and then hopefully they then go and take these away. And again, we're starting to see these kind of changes in our soaps as they introduce some of these ideas.
Very interesting, thank you.
Thanks. So while I think that this is a great initiative and it's a great tool for educating and being conscious to the audiences, I wonder if there's ever been raised the question of creativity freedom from their part, if they feel like this might be something that might not be what they were looking for, especially if they are not, for instance, publicly funded, and then they don't think they have to reply to social responsibility.
Yes, I mean, that's a challenge. I think it's a challenge both in kind of how we make our programs and also the creative content as well. So it's one of the reasons why I think directors are so important in understanding about this, and why I try to talk to directors and the directing community about this, because I think sometimes we've tried to implement sustainability through kind of green runners and junior people on a production team. And of course, that's very difficult. If you've got a big feature film and you've got a very famous director, it's very difficult to expect a runner to be able to tell the director to think about doing things differently. So I think, again, it's about making sure that we're engaging directors and producers and executives so that you've got that leadership role. And I would argue that generally speaking, directors are people that, being creators, understand these big social issues. Directors tend to come from perhaps more of a sort of center-left side of politics rather than a sort of right side of politics. So hopefully directors are kind of thinking about sustainability and are understanding these things. And I believe that if you can kind of inspire and educate, they actually choose to do the right things. I believe that people, when they know about it, want to do the best that they can. And so I think that's really important. But there is a challenge over content. There is a great fear in the UK that audiences are turned off by content about climate change and don't want to be, I agree, we shouldn't try and lecture people about climate change. And as a result, commissioning editors tend to say, we don't want you to have a program that's kind of overtly about climate change. You need to sort of hide that and bury it so it's much more subtle in the program. Now, I would argue that the time to have subtly buried content about climate change was 30 years ago, and we didn't do it. The scale of the problem is so alarming. We've got 8.5 years left in which to halve our carbon emissions. And so I think that time has run out to be subtle about this. I actually think we need to be bold and brave about this. But I don't think we should lecture people. We have a saying in the UK where we say, show, don't tell. Show positive behavior and let audiences make up their own minds about it. Don't tell people that you've got to change and you've got to do things. So I would always argue that the most effective way of doing all of this stuff is by leading by example, showing positive behavior, showing positive outcomes, hopefully audiences will kind of respond in a positive way.
Okay, thank you. We are approaching the end of the session. I would like to invite the rest of the audience to make a question, a last question. If somebody wants to contribute with even a comment or something that somebody wants to share with us. No? Otherwise, I would like to do a last question related to what Montserrat has said at the beginning. You are very organized. We have a lot of work to do, and I would like to know, what are your recommendations for us in the future?
Well, one of the first things I would do is, I would think engaging with Alberts would be a good thing for people to do in Spain. So if there's a community of creators in Spain that are interested in these things, I'm sure Rosa, who runs the international side of Albert, would be very happy to have a conversation. And again, the great thing is we've done a lot of that sort of hard work in setting up the systems and creating a template for kind of the training that we do. And also we've created the carbon calculator. These things exist already. So actually, people in Spain don't have to start from the beginning. You don't have to kind of invent all these things yourself. These tools exist. You just really have to engage with them and find a way that you can kind of start using some of these things. I mean, obviously there's a cost involved, the cost of running the calculator. And so when we work with international partners, there is a need for the international partners to contribute to some of the costs of running these things. But hopefully the benefits of doing that are enormous. And I would say it's probably cheaper to do that than start from scratch yourself.
I think clearly media is an active transformation agent that can not only contribute to greener literacy, but also make actual change. So I don't know, I think we're about to wrap up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And Steve, thank you so much once again for agreeing being here today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. And it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to talk to everyone. I hope it's been useful and helpful for you and given you something to think about.
Definitely.
And of course, if you have questions, then you can always email me, and or you can follow me on social media as well if you want. And so it's good to connect. And I think what's important is collaboration, isn't it? To solve climate change. We know we have to work collectively to solve this problem, and I think in our industry particular, we need to do that. We need to collaborate with each other to do what we can.
We'll definitely keep in touch. Yeah. Thank you very much. It has been great. Very useful. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Good night.
Goodbye.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you.